When the world was on the brink of an all-out nuclear war, the U.S. Army built a secret city that could survive the end of the world. It was built 100 feet under the icy grounds of Greenland. But then, something went terribly wrong. Something that the government tried to hide and almost got away with. But the thing about secrets is that they don't stay hidden. And you're about to discover the secrets of Camp Century, America's city under the ice. Alex Gardner was at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory when he got a disturbing message. It was from his colleagues who were up in the sky. They were flying over Greenland when their plane's radar picked up a strange signal. When they looked down, all they saw was snow, but the radar showed that there was something 100 feet beneath the island's snowy surface. Detecting man-made structures so far below the surface confused the crew and the scientists back at the Jet Propulsion Lab. "We didn't know what it was at first," said Gardner. "It could be an enemy base, or an ancient city. There was no saying what the scientists had stumbled upon until they ran up the chain with the information they had." They were told that what they had uncovered was actually a top-secret U.S. military base that was built in the Cold War era. NASA had discovered Camp Century. The location had been abandoned and was forgotten by almost everyone, especially the higher-ups. But the legend of the camp continued, mainly because of a book written by Henry Nielsen, in which he covered how the camp came about. It started in the 1950s when U.S. Army engineers started looking for the perfect spot to build an underground U.S. military camp. By May of 1959, they had settled on a rough location in Greenland, and a small party was sent to survey the area. It didn't take long for them to settle on the exact location and start drilling. But wait, isn't Greenland part of another country? How can the U.S. just march there and start building a military camp? The short answer is that they were already there. The U.S. helped defend Greenland against the Nazis, and in return got Denmark's permission to build military camps on the island. The agreement relating to the defense of Greenland, signed back in 1941, was renewed and rebranded as the 1951 Greenland Defense Agreement, allowing the U.S. to keep its bases on the island even after the Second World War. And this was really important, because right after the Second World War, the U.S. found itself in a Cold War with its former ally, the Soviet Union. And Greenland, being roughly the same distance from Washington and Moscow, became crucial for the U.S. Just being on the island wasn't enough. The U.S. military had to be well equipped and prepared to face off against the Soviet forces. And that brings us to one of the strangest secret military programs in U.S. history, Project Iceworm. The goal of Project Iceworm was to build a network of nukes under Greenland's ice sheet. Being able to launch these remotely would give the U.S. all the advantage it needed in a nuclear face-off, but only if the Soviets didn't know about the nukes in Greenland. So, how do you build a nuclear base in another country without looking like you're building a nuclear base in another country? You act like you're building something else. And that's how we get Camp Century, a highly publicized cover project meant to distract from what was happening in Greenland. Here's a video from the U.S. Army introducing Camp Century to the American public.
This is the story of Camp Century, the city under ice. It was in May 1959, after more than a year of preparation, that a small party of Army engineers conducted the final search to select a site for Camp Century.
This was the day we really got underway. We needed a flat surface, a level with less than 1 degree of slope. This would minimize construction problems by enabling us to keep all of our tunnels on the same level. Passages were cut through. Not all the excavation could be done by machine. The shovel was still a very useful tool. Next, work began on foundations for the prefabricated buildings that would be placed within the tunnels. Leveling the floor was very important to provide a good bearing for the foundations and prevent any building from settling unevenly.
All of this was being shown to the American public. Not just the construction process, but what was inside the camp after it was constructed.
Here there are showers for all and facilities for every modern convenience. It also has a small chapel for regular religious services. And it boasts the largest deep freeze in the world. Here is enough food to feed the camp for several months. The modern spacious kitchens provide a well-balanced and appetizing menu. To satisfy the enormous appetites that working in this climate produces means extra rations, but there's always more than enough.
When was the last time the government was so forthcoming about what was happening on its military bases? If this was broadcast today, we'd all take it with a grain of salt. But this was back when Americans used to trust their government. So they believed that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was genuinely working on building a city under the ice for scientific advancement. Plus, it was simply fascinating to watch what life was like under the ice.
Except for the fact that they have no windows, the men of Camp Century live exactly as do other soldiers. Their quarters are modern, spacious, comfortable, and are not lacking in any detail.
What that broadcast left out was the fact that the US had planned to install 600 Iceman missiles across 135,000 square kilometers of Greenland's ice sheet. The tunnels were meant to move around the missiles between 2,100 launch points. The plan was pretty bold, but was ultimately shelved despite getting favorable reviews from the State Department and the Department of Defense. Iceworm wasn't happening. But Camp Century, which was built to distract from Project Iceworm, was allowed to continue. And at this point, we see a remarkable shift in how the US talked about Camp Century, or how it stopped talking about the camp altogether. Initially, the public photos and video footage from the camp's construction were all over the media. But then, things went silent, incredibly silent. And then, one day, without explanation, Camp Century was abandoned. What happened? Why did the US give up territory, especially one under military use? We'd never do that unless we had a very good reason. And to find that reason, we need to know what was really going on at this secret military base. Of all the theories that people have come up with regarding Camp Century, the most fascinating one is the outer space theory. According to this theory, Camp Century was an experiment to see how well humans could survive in an isolated community, and whether they could sustain themselves on a different planet. The idea was to create conditions that emulate the remoteness and the disconnect of being on a different planet, or perhaps the moon. Keep in mind that the camp was built when the US and the Soviet Union were in the middle of a space race. And given that it ended with the US putting men on the moon, it's pretty reasonable to consider that maybe a permanent settlement was in the cards. If we did intend to colonize the moon back then it would make sense why we chose Greenland as our practicing ground. For starters, any colony on the moon would need to be underground, because the moon's surface is quite volatile. In the daytime, its temperature can go as high as 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and at night, it can go as low as negative 410. But if you dig just 2 meters below the surface, the temperature gets more stable at around negative 40 degrees. So, surviving on the moon would require being underground in a cold environment, just like Camp Century. Then there's the fact that most renders of space colonies look a lot like photos from Camp Century. Like, this is what a colony on Mars could look like. Notice how tunnels connect everything? Now look at these photos from Camp Century. The similarities are pretty evident. So, if you believe the outer space theory, then Camp Century was just the practicing ground for a planned colonization of the moon. And when the plan to build a permanent settlement on the moon was abandoned, so was Camp Century. A final pin on this theory is that the moon landing happened just a few years after Camp Century was abandoned. It's an interesting theory, but not a very sinister one, unlike the weather manipulation theory, which gets pretty dark. According to this theory, Camp Century is where the US installed its central weather manipulation device. From there, it can create natural disasters anywhere in the world. More importantly, it is where some of the most catastrophic floods, hurricanes, and earthquakes have emerged. Of course, such a device would draw a lot of attention and criticism, so the US abandoned Camp Century on paper, but in reality continues to operate it as a black site. This theory sounds far-fetched until you realize that weather modification is a reality. Scientists have tried techniques for storm prevention and hurricane modification. The most successful weather modification technique is called cloud seeding. It's basically artificial rain created by forcing clouds to shower down on command. Cloud seeding is so common that Dubai uses it for its annual rainfall, but at one point, the US military used it against its enemies. Operation Popeye was a 1967 military operation in which the US Air Force used cloud seeding to prolong the rainy season in Southeast Asia. The goal of this project was to disrupt Vietnamese supply lines by making the Ho Chi Minh Trail too muddy to use. So, bringing it back to the weather manipulation theory, we know that weather modification techniques work, and that the US has tried at least one against its enemies. With that in mind, do you find it hard to believe that we are better at weather manipulation now than we used to be in 1967? And if we are better at weather manipulation and have built a device that can cause natural disasters, then having it on American soil is probably not a good idea. It's also not a great idea to share this information with every other agency. If such a device exists, then all information about it would be kept on a need-to-know basis, which would explain why NASA was unaware of Camp Century's existence. And this theory also connects to what is happening in politics today. The ice in Greenland is melting, and Camp Century is going to be unearthed very soon. And just as that is about to happen, the US is suddenly interested in buying Greenland. Is the US trying to take over Greenland to keep this technology hidden? Or do they have other motives, as suggested by the survival bunker theory? According to this theory, Camp Century was meant to be the survival bunker of the shadow government. Basically, the higher-ups in the deep state decided to use US military funds to build a survival bunker for themselves. Remember that when the camp was built, nuclear tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were on the rise, so a bunch of powerful people building a nuclear shelter for themselves sounds pretty realistic, especially when you consider how many wealthy people have their own survival bunkers today. According to several reports, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, and Jeff Bezos have multi-million-dollar bunkers meant to insulate them from global catastrophes. And that's today, when the threat of nuclear war is much lower than back during the Cold War. So, of course, there was interest in survival bunkers. The question is, did powerful people in our government use Operation Iceworm as an excuse to build an underground camp for themselves? It seems like that, especially when you consider how Camp Century was built like a survival bunker and not like a typical military base. The Soviets had 2 Arctic bases, and both had runways and a very obvious military application. On the other hand, Camp Century was built like a city, with no offensive capabilities. The Nazis built an Arctic base during the Second World War. It was called Schatzgraber, or Treasure Hunter, and its main goal was to collect meteorological data. But despite being a research facility, it still looked more like a military base than Camp Century, which really feeds the narrative that it was meant to be a survival bunker for the puppet masters in the shadow government, something that has been proven to be true. These theories do have their flaws, but nothing that outright debunks them. Take, for example, the shadow government theory. Its biggest criticism is that if Camp Century was meant to be a hiding spot for the puppet masters, then why didn't they keep it a secret? But think about other things that the puppet masters are more than happy to advertise. The World Economic Forum at Davos is pretty heavily covered by the media. Even things they don't officially publicize make it into the mainstream, like the Bohemian Grove. It seems like the elites love to flaunt their exclusive meetings, clubs, and experiences. So it is on brand for them to advertise a nuke-proof city at the dawn of a nuclear crisis. It's a way to tell us plebs that they've got a shot at survival and we don't. And if we go with the theory that the camp housed a weather manipulation device, then its main criticism is that there is no proof that such a device exists. But the US military had access to GPS and the internet long before these technologies were made public. At this point, it's widely accepted that our Defense Department is 50 years ahead of the general public when it comes to technology. And remember, our Army has weaponized cloud seeding before, so it's definitely possible that we have other kinds of weather modification technologies that we haven't made public, and for a good reason. The atomic bomb was public, and Russia made one within 10 years of the US. AI was public, and China caught up with the US within a few years. Public technologies rarely stay within the borders of a country, so a weather modification device would have to be kept secret, and Camp Century would be the perfect place for it. It also makes sense that such a device could destabilize the ice cap, which is the main reason Camp Century was abandoned, because the ice was shifting. But before discussing why the camp was abandoned, let's go over the last point of criticism. And this one is about the outer space theory. And the criticism is that if the US built Camp Century as an experiment to see how well humans could survive on another planet, why did it try so hard to bury it? The US government owned up to human experiments, drugging its own citizens, and deploying a biological weapon on its own soil. But it won't admit that Camp Century was a trial for a space colony? That doesn't make sense. Unless what was happening at the camp was much worse than a simple trial of living in isolation. Now, these theories are pretty dark, but there is a very innocent explanation for the camp as well, that it was a way for the US to prove its technological supremacy. You could say that we wouldn't spend so much time and money on something just to brag about being more advanced. But that's literally what the space race was, and it was happening around the same time. So we really were in a battle for bragging rights with the Soviet Union. And think about how much of a technological marvel the camp was back in the 1960s. Our engineers had basically built an entire city 100 feet under the ice. On top of that, it was powered entirely by nuclear energy, making it energy independent. Plus, it had everything from a post exchange and a library to a chapel and a cafeteria. So, according to this view, Camp Century was built for bragging rights, and it makes sense when you consider how widely it was covered in American media. But then, why did the media stop talking about it? The answer to that is at the end of the U.S. Army's video on the camp.
Today, Camp Century is being operated as a year-round Arctic research center. The men who built the camp have long since been replaced by military and civilian scientists from the Polar Research and Development Program. As part of man's efforts to probe deeper and deeper into the secrets of the universe, an elaborate program of tests and experiments is being carried out.
Okay, so the camp was a publicity project that was converted to a serious research facility. And the media stopped covering it so our scientists could do their research in complete privacy. Then the camp was quietly abandoned and never discussed again. That sounds very suspicious, especially when you consider the government's official stance regarding the camp's abandonment. According to declassified documents, Camp Century was abandoned because of shifting ice. In other words, the camp was built on the assumption that the ice caps would be stable, but soon it was discovered that the snow was shifting at a rate of 40 meters per year. The movement started to damage the base's infrastructure, and even crushed some of its tunnels. The camp's nuclear reactor was also at risk, so the facility was abandoned. Makes sense, right? But here's where things don't add up about this story. It took 2 years to build Camp Century, so there was more than enough time to notice that shifting ice. Also, if the ice was moving at the rate of 40 meters per year, then there was more than enough time to dismantle the buildings and take away everything. But instead, the camp was abandoned within days. It really does sound like something else happened at the camp, something that the government doesn't want to reveal. Fortunately, the ice on top of Camp Century is melting, so at some point in the future, whatever was hidden at Camp Century will be exposed. And the US does not want that, which is why it is ramping up talks to take over Greenland. Buying the island from Denmark is one proposal. Another is to simply ramp up our military presence based on the 1951 Greenland Defense Agreement. The official story is that over 47,000 gallons of radioactive waste was left behind in Camp Century. If the camp surfaces, then the toxic waste in it would be exposed to the elements. But when was the last time our Defense Department was so interested in taking over a place to fix its environment? To be honest, it makes less sense than some of the theories we have discussed. It is more likely that the camp was indeed a much-needed survival bunker for military personnel during the nuclear standoff between the US and Russia. Project Iceworm was literally pitched as a way to give the US an edge in case of a first strike. The strike would be aimed at the US, and Greenland could be used to launch a counterattack. Denmark didn't allow nukes on the island, but what if we snuck them into the camp anyway? Or there's the possibility that the camp had a weather manipulation device, and it malfunctioned, causing the ice to shift. We really could go on and on about the possibilities, and each one would sound more realistic than the government's version. Camp Century was started as a cover operation to distract from Project Iceworm. And now, what they're telling us about Camp Century sounds like a cover explanation to distract from the truth. I personally believe that Camp Century housed nukes without Denmark's permission, and we need to take over the island before the camp surfaces and this fact is exposed. But what do you think? Is the official story more plausible than the theories? Or do you think that Camp Century hides a story that the government doesn't want to own up to? Like how the government doesn't want to own up to the horrifying experiments that it performed on Plum Island.